Hello everyone, welcome to MTX Chess. Thank you for watching this video. Today we're doing a deep dive into the Sicilian Defense, which starts with e4, c5. This is one of the most common openings in chess and it's played at all levels. In order to really understand this opening, it's important to review some chess history. So the oldest evidence we have of the Sicilian being played was from the 1500s by Greco, who was a fantastic Renaissance player. You may be familiar with the well-known mating pattern Greco's mate. But the opening didn't become popular until centuries later. In the 19th and early 20th century, king's pawns openings dominated the scene. As white, for about 100 years, everyone from Morphy to Capablanca was scoring very well playing the Ruy Lopez, which begins with e4, e5, knight f3, knight f6, bishop e5. At the time, we didn't have a great understanding of black's chances against this opening, and it was felt that black would be inferior. To give you an idea of how our understanding of chess openings has evolved over time, consider the open variation, one of black's responses to the Ruy Lopez. In that variation, black plays knight f6, and then after castle kingside, knight takes e4, d4, knight d6, exchanges on c6, and then after d takes e5, knight f5, queen takes d8, king takes d8. We reach this position. In 1925, Lasker, Emanuel Lasker, the world chess champion at the time, published a book where he said that black's position here was lost. Fast forward almost 100 years to today, and now grandmasters regularly play into this exact position as both white and black. Vichy Nan and Magnus Carlsen had this exact position over the board several times in their world championship match in 2013. But for about 100 years, this position was thought to be very inferior for black. But before we knew that black had decent scoring chances against the Ruy Lopez, we had to come up with something else. So in the 40s and 50s, players started looking for better responses to e4. c5 quickly gained popularity. Since then, about 17% of Grandmaster games have started with e4, c5. So now we understand kind of the background, some of the historical background to the Sicilian. Let's talk about some of the main ideas. So with c5, what black is doing, black attacks the center from the side, laying claim to the d5 square. If white pushes d4, black will capture d4, and white will have to capture back with the queen. In this position, black has exchanged a c-pawn for the very important d-pawn, and black can now develop the knight with the tempo on the queen. If we go back, the most common move for white in this position is knight f3. And after d6, d4, e takes d4, we have the open Sicilian. And this is where we're going to spend a little bit of time today. There are so many variations that come out of this position, it is really impossible to cover them all in one video. But I'm going to briefly touch on some of really the most common variations and just really call them out for you. So in our first variation, black plays a knight f6 to put pressure on the e4 pawn. A slower move, like pawn a6 out here, allows white enough time to play a move like c4. And what c4 is going to do is going to establish something called the Maroczy bind, where these two pawns on c4 and e4 have tremendous amount of power over this d5 square. What's going to end up happening in a game where white gets a chance to play the Maroczy bind is they're going to establish a really good center, and it's going to be difficult for black to push forward with things like knight f6, e6, and then d5, simply because white already has so much power over this d5 square. So the reason why a6 isn't always played right away is because this knight f6 move puts pressure on the e4 square, and if white chooses to play c4, then this pawn hangs. White usually defends with knight c3. And then here, this is an opportunity for black to go into the first variation we're going to discuss today, and that's the dragon variation, and that's play with g6, preparing the eventual bishop to g7. White in this variation, white will probably castle queenside, and both sides will have great attacking chances. This line makes for some really exciting games. So just to show you kind of what this line would look like, so it's white to move. So bishop e3 would be a very normal move. Bishop g7, queen d2, castle kingside, and then some combination of f3, castle kingside. Let's just say they play f3, and a6 gets played, castle kingside. And now we're done setting up the opening here, but what's going to end up happening is white's going to throw their pawns at the black's kingside. Black's going to do the same, and they're going to get their rook on the c file and really try and put some pressure on the king here. And so sharp variation makes for some very exciting games. And this later in the game, if black can keep this diagonal open, this bishop can really become this king's bishop, dark square bishop can really become a monster. So, all right, let's go back. So we are in this position. So after knight c3, black could also play what's just the classical Sicilian, which is knight c6, bishop g5, and again, white's preparing a queenside castle. Black can either transpose into the dragon or play e6 or even d5, kicking the knight off the square to get this dark squared bishop developed. Oftentimes, queen b6 is a popular move, putting pressure on this weak b2 square after the bishop had moved. So this is the classical variation of the Sicilian defense. So if we go back, in this position right here, so we talked about the accelerated, we talked about the dragon, we talked about the classical variation. Black could also play what's called the Schwenningen variation, which is e6. E6 keeps your options open. So this obviously can transpose into a couple of different things. If the bishop comes out, the knight comes out, we eventually play here, it's going to start to look a little bit more like a classical variation. But what it does is it allows space for the dark square bishop, so black can castle. It allows it allows black the option of eventually playing either e5, or if they wish, they could play d5 even. And so the Schwenningen variation is a great option for players who want to keep their options open kind of into the late opening and early middle game. And then the kind of final variation from this open Sicilian position that we'll talk about is the Najdorf variation. And the Najdorf variation is probably one of the most theoretically complex and well-known and well-studied variations. And the idea of a6, you might think like, oh, well, why is a6 an important move? First of all, it controls this b5 square from checks, from any funny business like the knight coming to b5. If you think about it, if you're black here and you want to push e5, this d6 square immediately becomes very weak. If you push e5 before playing a6 and covering this square, you're going to get a situation where you've got a weak d6 pawn with the potential with an attacking knight coming to b5. So controlling the b5 square is very important for a number of reasons, but it's also important simply because you want to push this pawn eventually to b5. Black is anticipating that white's going to go for a queenside castle here eventually later in the game after like the bishop comes here maybe, and the knight comes out, the queen comes up. White's preparing a queenside castle, and so for black already have a leg up preparing this b5 move and an eventual b5 coming down to b4. This a6 move is very important. So the Najdorf, very well known. There have been books written about the Najdorf, so there's a lot of theory to kind of go on here. But it's not uncommon to see a position like this, where a position kind of it gets to this point. So this is a pretty common position you'll see in the Sicilian Najdorf. So we've talked about a couple different things. We talked about the dragon, we talked about the classical variation, we talked about the Schwenningen, we talked about the Najdorf, kind of all variations on a theme there. But if we go back to the very beginning, so I'd love to show you kind of what I like to play in the Sicilian, because I think I found a variation that I'm really comfortable with, that I really, really enjoy playing. And it's not one of the open variations. So obviously in this position right here, black played pawn d6. But black doesn't need to play pawn d6. There's a couple different things black can do. So black can play the knight up to c6, and they can play like an accelerated dragon that way, and eventually fiend shadow the bishop there with the knight here. But what I love to do in this position after white plays the knight to f3 is I love to play the hyper accelerated dragon. So in this position, black plays pawn to g6. I love this line because if you're well prepared and understand the position, you can really punish your opponent. So let's say white plays d4, you're going to play c takes d4, and now white has the option of taking either with the knight or with the queen. And this is where punishing your opponent comes in if they're not well prepared. It can be tempting for white to take with the queen. They immediately put pressure on the rook. They centralize their queen. It seems like a good move. But if you know what you're doing as black, you can really make your opponent dance here. So the response from black is like knight c6. And then the most natural move for white really is just to push this pawn. And what can happen after this is, this was knight f6. This is knight c6. And so now white has to decide what they want to do with their queen. Is the queen going to come to a4, or is the queen going to come all the way back? If white decides to bring the queen all the way back, this knight can just come to g4. and now you got two attackers on this weak pawn. The pawn's very far advanced on the board. White can't quickly defend it. This black bishop's going to come to g7 with pressure on this pawn. What's going to end up happening is that this pawn's going to fall, and white is going to be missing their two most important pawns, their e and their d pawns, pretty early on in the game. So that's one option. If the queen comes back, usually the queen will come to like a4, and then this knight comes out this way. Someone might re-centralize the queen, and then after knight db4, bishop b5, the queen is coming to a5 with an attack here on the bishop, potential discoveries here on the king. This bishop's going to come to g7 with, this bishop on g7 is going to have a great target here on e5. The queen also, once this bishop moves, is going to be putting pressure on the e5, as is this knight. So I love the hyper-excited dragon when my opponent brings their queen out early, because you can just really kind of toy around with them, push that queen around, and get a lot of quick development with temples on the queen. So even though it's nice when the opponent takes on d4 with their queen in this position, it is still actually more common for them to take, and you'll see this more often, for just straight up knight takes d4. And after this, you can basically just transpose into your normal accelerated dragon. So in this position, it's tempting to play bishop g7. Looks like a normal move. It's also tempting to play knight c6. But the best move in this position is really knight f6. And the reason why that is because it puts pressure on e4, prevents white from playing c4, which would establish this Maroczy bind. And so that's why you play knight f6. And then all's well and good if white plays knight c3, and you kind of just transpose into your normal dragon. Your normal accelerated dragon. But the question is, what happens if white plays e5? E5 seems like a very natural move for white. So the answer here, it can be tempting to move your knight back, move your knight around, try and find a safe square for the knight. But really, the best move here is just knight a5 check. And so this is a classic fork. They can't defend against both these. White's commonly going to play knight c3, and then with queen takes e5. Black's just better here. You've taken both the e and the d pawn very early on in the game. You're going to have plenty of options for development, and just the queen can always come back to this very safe and very powerful c7 square. But if we go back, if the knight comes out here, now we're just kind of in our normal accelerated dragon. So the knights will come out, the bishop will come out, and this is kind of how the accelerated dragon really proceeds. Black castles queenside. Here, white might play something like f3, or they might bring the bishop back, or they might castle. And the whole point of the accelerated dragon, let's say the bishop comes back, and we push a5 here, and then they castle. The whole point of the accelerated dragon is to play d5 in one fell swoop. If you remember from our dragon variation in the Open Sicilian, where we played d6, the pawn was on d6, and you kind of had this little I can't draw an arrow, but there, this position right here, this pawn structure, you can imagine, kind of looks like a dragon. This might be the head of the dragon. This is like the hump of the dragon or the tail of the dragon. And so that's the dragon. The accelerated dragon, black's going to go straight up for d5 right away. After bishop takes, knight takes, pawn takes, knight takes, black's got a great bishop on the dark squared bishop. There are light squared bishops ready to come into the game. They've got this pawn ready to go. The queen's got good squares on c7 or possibly b6, and they got a very active knight. So that's what I really love about the hyper-accelerated dragon Sicilian. I would recommend that if you're trying to look for like a fun, exciting, sharp Sicilian to learn. So the hyper-accelerated dragon variation, definitely check it out. So I hope you found this video helpful. Please let me know if there's anything specific you'd like me to go over in some of my future videos. As always, you can challenge me on chess.com at mtxchessofficial. New videos coming every week, so please like and subscribe. Also, later this month, the World Chess Championship is coming up, and I'll be doing a series following every game, so you don't want to miss it. So yeah, thanks for watching, and see you next time.